So we have Jon Edvald, the founder and CEO of Garden.io. Jon, welcome. You're in Berlin right now, right?
That's correct. Thanks for having me. So I'm from Iceland, but based here in Berlin. Been here for about 6 years now. And settled in quite nicely. You can see my living room here in my background.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, we missed each other in San Francisco. We'll fix that next time. And when I'll be in Berlin, we'll check in. And let's start. Like today, we're going to talk about Garden.io, what you do, but also more importantly about the problems that you guys solve for your customers. Can you give us the 1 or 2 minute overview of what Garden.io does, and also obviously your background, because you and I met when you were still at BioWink, and just give us a 2 minute rundown, and then we'll dive a little bit more into the problems and the changes the world of infrastructure that you see your customers experiencing today.
Oh, for sure. I often say Garden is, I suppose like many a good startup, built in anger. It's because you mentioned Clue or BioWink, the company where I was last before starting Garden, found myself developing a lot of in-house tooling for us to stay productive. We had gone on this journey from very simple Heroku backend, like a Node.js application with a massive Postgres database, and it was kind of growing out of itself a little bit. We had a lot of users, and then moved to Docker Cloud, Kubernetes, and adopting those technologies turned out not the difficult part. It was staying productive with. Now you have to think about the DevOps practices and the microservices and testing across them. That all became tremendously difficult. And I was sort of begrudgingly building in-house tooling to solve these problems there. And I suppose in that process, started really thinking about, what's the tooling landscape like? What are other people doing? Always looking for a solution that sort of, felt natural and elegant to me. And here we are 4 years later into the journey of Garden, and obviously I didn't find one. I had to go and build one. So I meet my co-founders, and we start really digging into the problem, trying to define that further. And we set out to build something that would generally replace the in-house bundle of bash scripts that you might set up for yourself, or the sort of cobbled together automation that you might just happen to develop in your day-to-day as a growing DevOps oriented team. Mm-hmm. And rather give people something that they can just adopt that helps them with the day-to-day of modern cloud development. That's getting your development environments up, running tests, automating the workflows that happen in CI, making all of these processes faster, removing friction points, and to some degree, at least allowing some parts of your team to abstract the complexities of containers and Kubernetes away from, say, your web developer who really doesn't want to know too much about Kubernetes, but sort of thrust into that situation regardless. Basically, factoring out the things that are undifferentiated across a lot of different teams, allow them to focus on their own business problems, of which there no doubt are plenty.
Yeah. Fantastic. So Garden is an end-to-end cloud delivery platform that accelerates the customer development, testing, and CI/CD workflows. And before we go deeper into what Garden does and what the product does and how you build it, can you talk a little bit about what has changed in infrastructure in the last 5 years, or the relevant time frame that has created the need for Garden, and how do your customers experience that problem, and how do they discover all these different, like there's new world of cloud native and Kubernetes, and then how do they come to you then with the problems? Like, can you lay out that journey a little bit, and please, like, give us a few definitions in your own words, maybe of Kubernetes, because part of the audience here are executives, right? That may not always be familiar with these engineering terms.
Sure. Well, that's a few different topics. I'll kind of stagger through them. So in terms of the history, we can actually go, I'm not actually going to spend a lot of time there, but we can go all the way back to the 60s to kind of start this sort of journey from in terms of how we have defined the deployed applications. And, like we go way back, it's, a fairly literal monolith, like the mainframe that's a room-sized computer with one application that's doing one specific thing. And then into the 90s, you have servers and racks, and your managed data centers maybe, or you might just have them in your the back of your office. And then advent of cloud, like virtual machines, then, AWS. And then containers come along as sort of the next step in that journey. And what's happening all the while is the size of the individual deliverable goes from this big to this big to this big to this big. And instead of having one big application, one code base that's built one at a time, you have all these different discrete components that make up your entire cloud stack. And then throw into the mix all the different third-party cloud services that you might be using, the managed databases or event streams or whatever it is that you're using from your cloud providers. And then maybe fast forward a little bit further, like beyond containers, you have serverless, you have ever decreasing size of function. What's the implication is that whereas you could have sort of the automation and the pipeline for each big unit, and you can kind of define that sort of to suit that individual code base, because they're sort of in the 5s or 10s or sort of a manageable number of different code bases across an organization. Now it's getting into the hundreds and thousands even, and that's sort of beyond the like specifics of the technology of the containers and Kubernetes and how that all works. It's really the complexity of the graph of all the different things that comprise a system that is pushing the boundaries of like our current DevOps toolchain. There's sort of, you set up some scripts to automate from your CI pipeline. Doesn't really matter where you're like running that or which tool you use. It sort of functionally does the same. And then you maybe have some simplistic local setup for your development environment. And then maybe you have a bunch of different repos that are like your cloud system. Mm-hmm. That's all fine if it's simple enough, like sort of topologically. But now it's just gotten so the overhead of the individual setup you do for each component in the graph becomes so the math just doesn't add up anymore. And that, I think, is actually the more important part. So that plus the overall cultural shift of having developers be more autonomous. DevOps as a concept also coincides with this container evolution. Containers are just a way to package an application. They don't really represent the cultural shift, but the DevOps cultural shift is happening at the same time. And all of this just ends up being a heck of a lot of context for poor old application developer that just knows Java, knows React, and and just wants to see if their changes worked. Yeah. So it becomes this a mix of a cultural and a tooling challenge, and this is kind of where we enter the fray, along with that massive CNCF landscape of all the different companies trying to help out. Yeah. And we hope to be, both from a product standpoint and from a human standpoint, agents of clarity in this jungle.
Oh, that's a great description. Agents of clarity. Yeah. So then I love how you described the journey from the mainframe and how everything is getting smaller. The deliverable is actually getting smaller and smaller. But companies are adopting, if you believe the marketing materials, right? They're adopting cloud native architectures and containerization, all of that, for velocity reasons. Like, we want to be, we want to be shipping more product, and now every company is a digital company, and which all sounds great, right? And it probably also works in the beginning, but once you start really digging in, the complexities are actually way, way bigger. It's not a list of resources anymore. Now you have a graph of different resources and dependencies. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the infrastructure, like how everything is tangled? And you also mentioned the overhead of each resource. Like, can you clarify that a little bit for people and why it's important to understand that concept?
Well, so part of what Kubernetes promises is a bit of a standardization of how you describe how something is deployed, like how it acts at runtime. Kubernetes leaves as an exercise for the user, like how you build a container image. That's sort of Docker, and then a lot of actually other tools that can help with that too. But Kubernetes is responsible for taking a built image, container image, which is the built artifact that comes out of, after you change your code, and defining how this actually runs, like how many replicas of it should, how you can help use Kubernetes to help you auto scale things. You're sort of in advanced territory there. You can use it to do a lot of different things, but most, the sort of fundamental thing that you're doing is running your container images in a cluster in a repeatable fashion, in a deterministic fashion. And that actually, that is the, one of the biggest benefits of Kubernetes is that there's a lot of nuance to it. And it doesn't always go that smoothly, but in principle, you should have, if you want to run Kubernetes on your laptop, it mostly works the same way as it does on AWS or Google Cloud. From experience, we learned that not quite that simple. But, there's a lot of different ways it starts to drift. And, to some degree, that's sort of to be expected. These are complicated concerns, and Kubernetes just the abstractions don't really carry over to certain domains. But the promise is that you have now sort of a common language, the way you describe how to run a system. And that helps bring consistency. You can start to build a whole ecosystem around something that is sort of a common interface. And then, you walk around at KubeCon, you see all these different companies. They now have sort of a common base layer that they can build around.
Yeah.
You can argue like that maybe there's a little bit too much that had to be built around it. But, Kubernetes is not the end of the road either. I think there's going to be something else, before we know it. There's emerging technologies all the time, but fundamentally, the practices that we're developing, I think those are here to stay. This sort of how you declare how something should be deployed, declarative infrastructure with infrastructure as code, the movement to bring developers self-service environments and not have to have humans in the loop for all manner of different things. A sort of classical throwing code over a fence to an ops team.
Yeah,
that's what we're getting out of. And whatever the underlying technology is that you use to actually run the containers or functions, that's the, for us, Kubernetes is Kubernetes is a plugin for Garden. It's where we spend most of our time now, and that's where customers have hair on fire problems trying to understand what the heck is going on and need a bit of help. And it's been a sort of an interesting gateway into the market for us. But ultimately, it is a little bit more about the practices involved and how this transition to the brave new world of DevOps.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few terms there: infrastructure as code, and development pipelines. Help me understand where Garden is sort of in that ecosystem. And there's actually, if you want, I can give a quick screen share of your website here. And I thought there was an intuitive visual here. So you talked about, can we dive in a little bit more into the whole world of containers, Kubernetes, and then, we see the GitHub Octocat here. Talk a little bit more about what's happening and then where your hook comes in and how your product specifically helps and works.
Sure. So, and it's always an interesting conversation to have because this tooling landscape is indeed of this very complicated Venn diagram of different things.
Yeah.
What we specifically help with And so what? So maybe I'll start with how Garden is actually deployed. So we have an open core, which is a CLI tool. You run it from your terminal on your laptop. You run it from a CI pipeline. And that's actually one of the most interesting points about Garden is that it helps with both. It helps both developers do their rapid iteration from their own laptops, even with remote environments, which is an important part of this evolution. You know, the ever more complicated graphs of things, they're not going to just run on your laptop, no matter how big a CPU you might get on it. So you can run that during development. You run with the same configuration from your CI system. So you remove a lot of the friction between the two. But you can keep using your own CI system. Garden Cloud gives you an option to just integrate directly to your GitHub or GitLab, but functionally that does the same thing. The key thing is that Garden carries, so it comes with a configuration language called what we call the stack graph. So next to each part of your system, or your container image, or Helm charts in Kubernetes land, your manifests, etc., you can have Garden also render these for you. Your Terraform stacks, your Pulumi stacks, maybe. You put a bit of Garden metadata next to each of these. Garden will pick all that up. Based on what you say, like compile this graph. That was the image above the other one in your screen share. We built this directed graph of everything that needs to happen between a bunch of Git repositories and a fully built, deployed, tested system. So this, yes, that's an example of
that's the one here, right?
Of the graph required to deploy this simple demo application that we often show. So you can see it involves builds. You need to deploy a database. You run some database migrations, maybe. Then you run an integration test. You deploy another service, and so on and so forth. And you declare how all these things depend on each other. And Garden can then be smart about, I run Garden test on my machine, and basically make sure everything is up so that it actually does work. You can define test suites that actually run in the environment so that you can run integration and end-to-end tests quite cleanly and easily. And then, you make some changes to your code, you run Garden test again, and Garden knows which file goes into which build, goes into which deployment, goes into which test. So we can work out which parts need to be acted upon and which ones don't. So we can help automate that process. And once you've described your system to Garden, you now have a canonical description of this whole process from source to finish. So through the journey from a bunch of Git repositories to a built, deployed, tested system. And then that's portable between different developers, between development and CI and CD. You can even use it to deploy to production, which some of our customers do. And the key thing you get is basically consistency. It's always just Garden deploy or Garden test. And then you have, of course, a lot of other much more specific tools and commands to work with in your day-to-day. And then you sort of build from there. And then on top of that, we have a commercial product that helps you manage all the different environments that you might have. You have, cleaning up unused environments, which actually can save a good deal of money.
Yeah.
I think, one of our customers said we added a feature for them so that they could pause running environments, and they trimmed their GCP bill by 2/3. And that's sort of part of this brave new world. You actually need to have your development environments to be proper cloud environments, and that that brings some costs with it. And that's the type of thing that our commercial product helps with, as well as just administration in general.
Yeah.
But the key thing is this automation and allowing teams to fully codify this journey, and then that's repeatable and predictable.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of things where I want to dive deep. I'll start from the back. I think the importance of testing environments also as part of your cloud bill. But I'll start with, and I stopped sharing the website because people like seeing the people talking to it, right? But it's this notion of a graph, and I'll just share just one more time just to show people here. The action here is give me a Postgres database, right? That's it. Like, oh, I want a database, right? But what happens behind the scenes here, so many other things and dependencies, right? Here's a Redis cluster, APIs, and everything. So I think that's one of the key insights that people from a business perspective, or business executives, don't always appreciate. That like spinning up a database means spinning up a gazillion other things, and they all need to be tested, right?
Yeah. And especially like the production ready ones. I mean, this is a sort of a toy example. I spin up Postgres in a container in my Kubernetes namespace. You never do that in production. You actually run a managed service somewhere, and then that needs to have like authentication set up and networking, whitelisted and all manner of different things that, it adds up for sure.
It does. It does. And so what Garden does, I'm using my own words now. Would it be appropriate to say that, okay, so you capture that process and you standardize that process, and then you help people automate it, and you do that across teams so that everyone sort of is like on the proverbial same page. Is that a okay description?
Yeah, in many ways it is. I think actually one thing that we have learned is that we have to be careful to what degree we are opinionated, because we have customers ranging from small teams from back in Iceland to Fortune 500, and they're all using the same product, and we quite deliberately designed it. So we have two major personas that use our product. So we have the person who usually signs off on and adopts Garden initially is the Devops team, for lack of a better term. Like, it could be a platform team, could be a tooling team, developer enablement team. We see various different names, or even just like those 1-2 individuals at a team that actually are responsible for these things, depending on your scale. And for them, Garden is as much a framework to allow them to describe their system fully. We offer some opinionated structures if you want them, but you can also go pretty low level and do basically whatever it is that you need to do. And then we have the other persona, which is the application developer. They're just working on the backend logic, or they're working on the web UI, or whatever the case may be. And then further, you also have QA and product managers, or even sales engineers, like setting up demo environments. That's sort of a longer tail of users that we see. But key thing is that we allow the tooling teams, or the ops side of DevOps, to codify how the application works, and then just pass that on to people that then don't have to think so much about it. But we certainly have. I suppose early days, we thought we would be in the abstraction game. We were going to create something simplified on top of XYZ, and then Kubernetes at the time. And we have been a little bit humbled by that mission, I suppose. And I suppose we realized along the way that we're actually not in the abstraction game. We're in the automation game. And we can provide helpful abstractions to get you started, but us trying to decide how a system should be deployed exactly, beyond things that are like very generalizable and things that people just want to get out of their way, we've learned to be a little bit more careful with that. It's actually, and this sort of, it's a difference in approach to some of our analogs in the space that maybe provide the more opinionated structure, and which is simpler to get going, but it limits the scope of who we can actually engage. So we made some choices on that, in that regard, and I think that'll make Garden functional for more different types of teams.
Yeah. Yeah, because I see that the high level of abstraction, I'll pick a name, Heroku, right? As you said, it's great to get started, but you very quickly run into limitations, right? It turns out like everybody wants to do their own stuff. At least that's what I see.
I mean, if people wanted that and they were fine with it, they'd all be actually using Heroku or Cloud Foundry, which and somehow Kubernetes came out on top and is the most elaborate and complicated out of all of them. So I think, just accepting that reality, and also just understanding that, like Garden principally doesn't know what a container is or Kubernetes is. It's all in the sort of plugin layer. And for us to support, whatever follows Kubernetes, maybe there is something that catches on that is quite a bit simpler and, works for a wide array of different users. You see efforts, at the runtime level, you see things like Fly.io, for example. Vercel does interesting stuff.
Yep.
And then you have this whole, realm of server-side WebAssembly, which is very interesting to me. And and the thing is, for us, that's just a matter of adding support for different platforms. What we can then do, and what Garden can then offer in that context is you've sort of decoupled your tool chain from the individual platform, so you can sort of you can mix and match things as you grow. And ideally, you should be able to start with Heroku and then move to Kubernetes when appropriate. But some people want to preempt it, just go for Kubernetes, like, bite the bullet early. I suppose, either you can make the case either way, like, there's such a thing as optimizing too soon. And but, it can also be very expensive to have to retool later. So
yeah.
People are kind of trying to toe that line all across the industry.
Yeah, I think it's good to keep that in mind when you start, right? Just to know about that trade-off. Two things that I'd love you to elaborate on, and that's testing and your stack graph. Let's talk first about the relevance of testing environments and testing in general, right? Like you mentioned, for instance, like, one of our customers, they tore down their testing environment. Can you talk about the size of testing versus production and how that has changed over time, or has it changed at all, right? Do you see that changing? And I won't lead the witness. I have a few preconceived notions, but I'll want to hear from you what you see.
Sure. I mean, this has been a topic near and dear to me. I mean, I did a talk once called Cloud Native Testing, and I'm sort of like kind of diving into what are the concerns there, like what's the landscape right now, and there is a lot of movement there. I think, kind of going back to that, the increasing complexity of the graph and all the different individual deliverables. An implication of that is it increases the importance of actual integration, runtime testing, as opposed to unit tests with mocks and stubs, because the overhead of doing that and the likelihood of something actually going wrong, and there's a bug in your test stub, and then you miss the actual runtime bug, or you catch it in production, which may be too late. People are realizing that they're also hitting scaling limits of the sort of more Martin Fowler-esque conventional wisdoms around microservice testing, and one of those is like integration testing is something that you should like avoid like the plague, because it slows everything down.
Yeah.
Now we're sort of hitting a threshold where we kind of have to go and reconsider that a little bit, because the ratios and the math doesn't add up for the sort of VM era of microservices, as you might frame it. So We are starting to see more and more tools around this, where Garden's role in this is really just understanding which test suite to run at what time, caching test results, but not so much getting into how you write them. But the functional benefit of having something like Garden, and I would actually just say Garden, there's not a lot of tools that focus on testing sort of in this same mix, is that you don't have to push to Git and wait for CI to actually run these tests. It is prohibitively expensive to even write an end-to-end test if you have to do that for every iteration, because that will take some arbitrary amount of time. Usually the pipelines are not particularly smart, so they just go through the whole build, deploy, test process for every, if you change a README, it will go through a 20-minute process. And that's part of what we're battling is if you have this graph and you know which file goes into which build, goes into which deployment, then test, etc., you can be smart about it, and you can automatically run test suites that are look to be affected by the modifications you made. And that means, and I can do that from my laptop. So that means I can work on an individual test suite in a real environment from my laptop and not have to make CI a broker in that process, and which is often the case in even these sort of inner dev loop. So it makes it easier to actually write the tests. You don't have to wait as long for them to run eventually. So it becomes viable again. And I would argue absolutely crucial as the complexity of an application moves from the individual code bases to the surrounding structures and the connections between. And that's where a lot of the failure points are. Did I accidentally snake case and not camel case that variable that goes over the wire to that other service? Like what assumptions did I make in terms of the API? You're going to want to actually test it as opposed to test the fake version of it. So that's part of the development that we are both just observing, and we have, I suppose, been pushing since 2018. Realizing now that we were a little bit early in that.
Fine balance, right? When you run a startup, because you have the big vision, but is the market getting traction, or is the market realizing that same issue as well? Yeah, and so I think the insight here is that testing as a general activity and also as a share of your infrastructure in terms of number of resources and also spend, as you mentioned, has grown over time and will probably keep growing over time. I know everyone is obsessed about production because that's where the money is, as people say, right? If you have a retail app or e-commerce app, of course, that's where the money is because that's where all the transactions are. But the true work to make it work is happening before that, right? Like that's where you do your builds and your testing.
For sure.
And that's just getting way more important now.
Yeah, and more complex. I mean, I think, and which isn't purely incidental complexity. There is a fair amount of incidental complexity. It just kind of comes with the territory and doing cloud and all of that. But it is also the fact that the importance of scale and security and throughput, the volume of data that we wrangle in our day-to-day now is so much bigger than it was 10, 20 years ago. So there are legit reasons for all the added complexity, but there is also some incidental stuff, and like complex APIs that maybe that we should maybe be able to factor out a bit. And there are opportunities at the sort of tooling and abstraction level to fix some of these things. And to your point, production often leads ahead of development, and then you have the sort of the developer experience trying to kind of frantically catch up to what's being done at the production side. Yeah. And that was absolutely the case with Kubernetes. It was really made for operators more than it was for developers. And then it actually kind of goes for containers as well. there's a lot of implicit challenges in just, dealing with containers as part of your developer cycle. Like, how do you rapidly introduce changes and have them visualized in front of you or run tests fast? This is all very difficult to do. And when we had a booth at KubeCon in 2018 with an idea of a product, practically, like we had an alpha version, and I remember us sitting in the hotel room just kind of hacking away for the demo the day after. those were the days. But
yeah.
We showed up at the booth there, and the demographic, the makeup of the people there was so different compared to just the last one we went to. We were going on the messaging that we were making building and employing and testing Kubernetes applications faster. Multiple times we get people just asking why. I don't know, just completely caught by surprise with that question. I thought that was sort of an obvious concern, but it just goes to show how much the operations and production side of that, a DevOps product will have that end of it. So the ops side of DevOps was very much in the foreground at that time. And then the sort of what's often called like day two problems, and that's developer experience, security. For some reason, that should be a day one problem, but it is a day two problem.
Yeah.
And those things, that's most of the booths you see at KubeCon today. It's people, kind of catching up to, the productivity, security, developer experience, those types of things. So yeah, and that sort of supports my thesis that maybe we were a touch early, but that's totally fine. We made it through.
You made it through. That's fantastic. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So then, and every time you talk, I have more things I want to dig into. We do want to go into the stack graph, and I think let's cover that one first. But then you mentioned how the people at KubeCon had changed, right? And that's something I want to hear from you, how you describe that change. But first off, I do want to talk about the stack graph. And for people who don't know what the stack graph is, I think that's a core concept within Garden. I'll let you explain it, right? But it describes a customer stack in one consistent, structured way. But can you talk? And I think it goes to the fact like how you're replacing bash scripts and all of that good stuff. But talk about what is the stack graph? Why a graph? Why does it matter? And what's the innovation?
Yeah. So you're quite right. It is. So what it is fundamentally, it's a way to declare the journey from a bunch of Git repositories to a fully built, deployed, tested system. And I suppose you could look at it as a sort of an expansion of the what Terraform does for infrastructure, for example. Mm-hmm. You have sort of a declarative, this is what I want my infrastructure to actually look like. And then Terraform as a tool resolves that to make sure that make it so. You apply that description onto your cloud account or accounts plural. And Garden Stack Graph in many ways is an extension of that, but now it's on top of just applying infrastructure, which is really just interacting with APIs on the cloud side. We actually integrate with Terraform and Pulumi to just kind of handle the infrastructure parts because those are quite powerful tools for that. But you add to the mix, how do you build the container image that then goes into which Kubernetes manifest that is then applied to the Kubernetes cluster? I have this test suite. I need that service to be up and updated before I run that test suite. So you add a lot of these relationships. So fundamental to the stack graph are basically these 4 verbs that we keep using: build, deploy, test, and run. It's a sort of a catch-all for I need to run like a database migration or something else. And that's really ultimately the semantic structure. And then you have corresponding Garden commands to actually execute all this. And a deployment, often will depend on a build being done first. Test may depend on a deployment, and or another build, so on and so forth. It's basically a way to describe the relationship between all these different things. And the reason it's to make it a graph is because it kind of already is. It's just, you want to encode it as such. And in that sense, it also borrows something from, take like build systems like Bazel, which is born out of Blaze at Google. And then you have other similarly minded build systems where they go a little bit more low level, like at the file level, like how you build individual files. And they're really well suited to large, complex code bases like, Chromium or something like that. But ours is a little bit more granular. Like, you build a container image and then Garden doesn't really mind what's being built within that image or which programming language you use. It's just about high level describing all these different steps, what depends on what. And the point of it being, a typical use case is I need to go from not having a development environment to having a development environment with a running version of the system. And then, as part of my CI pipeline, I want to run all the integration tests. And your CI pipeline basically becomes Garden test because the complexity is all encoded in the graph. Mm-hmm. And Garden just, connects to your Kubernetes cluster, creates a namespace, and so on and so forth, and deploys all of that for you. The intuition being that if you have that description, that's your baseline for building a lot of tooling and productivity. And then we can start to reason about your system in so many different ways. And you can repeatedly do the same thing over and over again from different machines and different laptops, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of the foundational layer, and everything else is sort of sugar on top.
Okay. And how do I use the stack graph if I'm one engineer versus a team of 100 engineers or 10 engineers? Like, how does that scale across these team sizes?
So with a larger organization, you usually have some people who are dedicated to your tooling setup. They may be working on your sort of in-house tools. They may be responsible for your CI setups, et cetera. And they would then, do the initial steps. Like they would start describing your system with the stack graph. And then maybe a first use case for them is deploying a preview environment for every pull request that's made, something to that effect, or running your tests. And then they sort of hand it off to the developers that don't necessarily have to think too much about how it's set up, but they just use it. For smaller teams, people tend to just be a little bit more hands-on and kind of get into all of it. But the process is you set up a project, which is really just a bit of YAML at the top of your any of your repositories, really. And then next to each container image, you put what we call currently a module, or basically a build. And then you might have a Helm chart that uses that image. You put a little bit of Garden YAML next to that. Just here's the Helm chart that I want deployed. And Garden will find all of this in your repositories. But the adoption path is conceptually similar, but with the smaller teams, they tend to be tend to be both personas, maybe. They're both the sort of ops and the dev. So they kind of, and in some cases that could be quite efficient. But I suppose our sort of sweet spot in terms of team size tends to be, sort of high growth stage. Like we're adding a lot of developers. We just raised the Series B or Series C, and then everything's kind of taking off. And our bundle of bash scripts doesn't quite cut it anymore. So that's sort of our sweet spot. But we do certainly work with smaller teams on occasion.
Yeah. And so then I actually have a framing for your product in my mind, but I'm going to ask a few more questions to see if it holds up. So what you're doing then is you're essentially industrializing the testing process for these companies, right? And why does that matter? Well, if you industrialize it, it means you can scale it out much faster. And that means you're getting more development velocity, which is what they all want, right? Because you mentioned Series B and C. All these companies get funded based on their growth rates. They're not getting funded based on their amount of revenue. Sure, that's part of the equation, but really people looking at the growth. Why is that? Well, because I think there was a McKinsey study that said, like, it's not the first mover, like, the classic MBA talk, first mover advantage wins. That's not true anymore. It's the companies that grow the fastest who win and gain market share the fastest. So from that monologue that I just held, the growth, going back to the stack graph now becomes, or has become, a core part of a company's IP for their go-to-market, right? Because, like, if going to market means shipping more features faster, well, I need to test more. How do I industrialize it? I use the stack graph. Like, the stack graph is a new asset that has a huge value of the company. Maybe I'm exaggerating and I'm preaching to the choir, but I feel like that's the sensation that I get.
No, I love it when people sell garden to myself. And and industrializing is a good way to frame it, actually, and not one that I'd used before. But I'm endlessly looking for, to sort of improve in terms of how we frame and message around, like, what it is that we do, because it's a non-trivial topic, and there's a lot of new words being flung around that people are just kind of trying to get a handle on. But certainly, industrialization, automating, so that you can handle scale. You automate so that you can onboard faster. Like, if a developer can just sit down and run Garden deploy and they have an environment, as opposed to going through a lot of sort of human in the loop processes, like traversing, some number of readmes that may or may not be up to date. They just have a codified description of a system, which is implicitly validated to be correct because it actually runs through your CI system as well. It's like you make your system self-documenting in a sense. Mm-hmm. And this is critical as you add a lot of developers to a team, as you have a increasing sprawl of different sub teams on a team, and they need to work on different things in different ways. What you don't want is these sort of bespoke CI pipelines across an organization, and that's a concern. Like at the Fortune 500, all the way down to these fast-growing companies, it can start to bite you really fast. And I think that's a sort of a broad market trend that we see a lot of. People are talking quite a bit about this, and our analysts at Gartner, for example, they talk a lot about this, and they tend to talk to the sort of larger, more enterprisey companies. Mm-hmm. And they've been feeling this transition and looking to, I guess, so they're kind of trying to figure out, what do we centralize and standardize on? And what can we pick that doesn't preclude us from making choices in the future? And that's sort of the line that we're trying to find with Garden, and how we design it is, how can we provide a lot of capability for industrialization and automation without creating this hindrance when it comes to whatever other technology that you want to adopt. And I think, we're really just kind of getting started in terms of what you can build around this graph structure. Once you have it, it's very powerful. You could imagine, for one of the things that we're working on now is an integration with Snyk, for example. And this could also be any other sort of security DevSecOps vendor, because we already know where every bit of every container image is across your project or organization. We just have to then project that information into Snyk, and then you can, Garden can automatically inject a test for every container to check for vulnerabilities, because you already have a machine readable description of how your system works. Yeah, that just as an example of the many things that we can start to then build around this structure. That's why we emphasize the stack graph quite a bit, and looking to make that sort of I suppose, we don't really talk too much about it on our website now, but that's evolving. I think we've realized that whereas, it's important to talk about the immediate back pains that a customer has, it's also important to talk about why it is important to choose this way of solving it as opposed to patching with a different approach.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do they understand that? And is there a light bulb moment involved? And I'm asking because I used to work at Instana. We had a graph, right? Like we came from the microservices monitoring perspective. Like, how can you monitor something that has so many dependencies, but you look at an individual resource, like it doesn't work, right? And talk to me about how do people appreciate the concept of the graph? And once you explain it to them, do you feel like the light bulb goes on? It's like, oh, this is why I should use Garden and not some other random bash script or tool.
Yeah, no, I think for sure. I think we've been sort of going the adoption bell curve, and we've been sort of we're kind of making that step from early adopter, and up the hill. And I think a lot of especially our earliest adopters, this clicked for them really early. Mm-hmm. And that, sort of our conceptual approach to the problem, as much as the literal tooling that they get and the automation that they get sort of out of the box. And I think a lot of our customers, they choose Garden because of this, mm-hmm. Over some, ostensibly analogous solutions out there that are maybe these, those are perfectly fine products, of course, that, maybe Kubernetes dev environment solutions, all mm-hmm. these environment as a service providers that sort of do the, ranging from the sort of Docker Compose in the cloud to something a little bit more elaborate. They all serve a purpose, and we overlap in use cases in that regard. But what they don't have is this sort of canonical description of how a system works. And I think as we start to leverage that further, now we're growing the team quite aggressively, and now we can sort of start to exercise the potential of all this.
Yeah. And you mentioned Terraform and Pulumi a couple of times. Pulumi is fairly new in the context of infrastructure as code, but can you talk a little bit about that world, which I guess precedes or sort of a step before Garden kicks in? But what do you see happening in that world and infrastructure as code? Like, what's going on there?
Well, I mean, so Terraform has sort of established itself as just kind of part of the furniture. I mean, it's such a widely used and known solution, and as far as we can tell, quite a bit more popular than, say, CloudFormation, which is of course also AWS specific, and also I don't know, that doesn't have as elegant an API, I suppose. But Terraform, I just see that I don't imagine it leaving anytime soon. I think it's well battle tested solution, and a large number of our users and customers use, and partly I suppose they pick Garden because we support both Kubernetes and Terraform. You can, in that graph, you can deploy whatever you need with Terraform before you deploy that service, and you could sort of make that as part of the same flow. Pulumi, that integration works exactly the same. And that's an interesting one because, I think it appeals to a certain demographic because, you're using code, like literal code, not like declarations, to describe what you want from your infrastructure. And I think it's an interesting path. I think there's pros and cons. Mm-hmm. I think, if you have a need for that expressiveness, then Pulumi does a really good job. And I think I imagine Pulumi and Terraform sort of maybe gradually evening out a little bit in terms of adoption levels and establishing themselves quite nicely. Yep. We just very, very recently introduced the Pulumi integration, so we got quite familiar with how it actually works, and we can certainly see this trending in an interesting direction. We chose to go for the more configuration-oriented way of declaring, because that is actually something that's easier to reason about from a plugin provider perspective. You can start to automate a little bit differently around it. But for the function that Pulumi provides, I think it does a really good job.
Mm-hmm. And because we see a lot of activity in that space. It may seem obvious for people like you and me, but I always feel like there's still such a broad share of the market that hasn't gotten to that point yet. Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the journey of your users and customers finding you? You mentioned the Series B and C companies, and how do they find out about you? And I'll share briefly your GitHub repo here, which is I think is super nicely done. I mean, the stars talk for themselves, speak for themselves. But if I go through this here, it's very nicely done. It's, I mean, full of great information in here, use cases, and why use Garden. So, but and then you have obviously your hosted version of the product, and you also have a website. But like, how does a user find out about Garden? Like, what's going on in their mind, and how do they find you, and where do they start, and then how do they dive in and roll up their sleeves? How does that work?
Well, I think so. What we most commonly see, that's besides our own efforts to actually go find people, and we do have people doing that for us now, and we're just building out our marketing function now. So I think it's been a lot of so I suppose word of mouth in a broad sense. That also means being listed alongside other tools and blog posts, and usually made by other people than us. We have a few blog posts that have gotten a fair amount of reads, on Medium and on our own blog, that kind of spoke to something that people were Googling for. But it's usually, you happen upon Garden in some other context. You're kind of exploring the Kubernetes dev toolchain, for example. And you hear about it in some other context. There are, the keywords that we see coming in, like Kubernetes development tools, Kubernetes CI, Kubernetes testing, things of that sort. But it is certainly looking to solve problems in the realm of Kubernetes. That's kind of where we positioned ourselves, and that's where a lot of our focus is today. It most often is the sort of SRE tooling persona at a company, whoever's responsible for their developers' happiness, or CI setups, or developer experience. They're the ones that come find us, and then the application developers tend to come in, into the conversation in sort of a second step. That's sort of the usual MO. And now, it'll be interesting to see how this develops. Now, we've been a small team until I've actually doubled the team size just since the beginning of the year, and we can actually spend some money on marketing, which is exciting. So I'll be keen to see how this develops over time. And I suppose lastly, showing up to conferences and events, now that we can start to do those in person more and more again, that's always been quite effective for us.
Yeah. And do people start with your GitHub repo? Is that how they explore you, or do they go straight to the hosted version? I don't even know if you have a free version or a freemium version, but it's like, and the importance of your open source package versus the hosted version, has that changed over time at all?
Well, I mean, so we've only had the commercial product out, properly out, since the beginning of last year. So we went from 0 customers at the beginning of the year to where we are today, and it was a pretty successful leap. I was very happy with last year, how that panned out. And one important thing to note is, sort of business model wise, because we keep mentioning like Terraform, for example, Terraform is a CLI tool and Terraform Cloud is a managed service. We have Garden Cloud and Garden Enterprise, which is the same thing, except you deploy it in your single tenant or in your own infra. And it is built around the open core. It is not a commercial version of the same thing. That's, from a licensing perspective, like we really wanted to avoid, I suppose, like an Elasticsearch type conundrum. So we just have a pure value add on top where, the CLI tool is just that. It doesn't remember anything. It just runs where it runs. But Garden Cloud, the Garden Platform product you get all of your, information about every environment. Every execution of Garden is logged. You get like a proper web dashboard. You can see your service logs. You can clean up environments. Anything that requires persistent state and a nice web user interface, that's in the commercial product. So it's a value add on top of the open core. But to answer your question, we definitely see a mix. We see, people kind of, asking questions so we have a channel on the Kubernetes Slack. We have our forum, like community.garden.io. People might ask questions there. And, that may lead to a commercial conversation at some point, or we just keep supporting them in a community, which is also totally fine. But sometimes people, they come knocking on the door first. They want us to talk about the product and demo it sort of end to end before, just as part of their own exploration. So, and, people go and, they split into different camps, like where I suppose it's sort of, do they tend to build or buy, just sort of as a general baseline. And some people like really don't want to buy anything. They want to build everything in-house. And some are quite the opposite, but usually it's somewhere in between. And that would often sort of dictate to whether you ask us for a demo like through the website early in the process, or if it kind of comes in a little bit later.
Got it. Okay, and so then with that user journey, let's put ourselves into to wrap up, because when we started talking, it was light outside in Berlin, and now it's actually getting dark right there.
Yeah, that's true. The white balance is adjusting appropriately. It's great.
Okay, so maybe I'm the newly hired VP of engineering at a fast growing Series B company, and I come in and everything that I was promised was completely overpromised, not true. I see all the mess that's happening, right? As it always happens. What are sort of your top 3 or top 5 recommendations for these people as they look into how development and testing is done? And where would you say, like, those are the 5 best things we recommend you do, if there exists, or 3 things? I don't know. Does anything come to mind, or patterns you've seen across your customer base of what works and what doesn't work?
Sure. I don't have an immediate count just up front, but let's
rattle them down.
Let's just see what comes up. So one thing that comes to mind, that having been this person joining, literally my last job, I joined as a VP of engineering, and I see everything that's wrong. Why do we do this? And why do we do that? And, why don't we do this? First thing to realize, there's usually an answer for that. You had to make choices at a time. You had to make trade-offs. We don't do this because that tool didn't exist when we first set it up, or we had to rush a customer feature or whatever. There's, take a breather and just accept that, things are complicated and everybody's trying their best. Yeah. That's sort of, it's a good mindset to kind of walk into whatever transition you're about to instigate. Mm-hmm. And then, really kind of, try and filter it down to where are people wasting hours, and kind of try and analyze it. Survey your team, actually ask them, how much time do they spend on, we did a survey like this, and we routinely ask people who are starting to talk to us to give us sort of a self-assessment, or ask around on their team where they are, sort of what are the most pressing problems really, because they may not be the ones that you can think of. or think are the most important. Ask, are you spending too much time waiting for pipelines? Is it that it's hard to get your development environment up and running? Do you have to fight with your tools a lot? Do you spend a lot of time writing them? And you can kind of like go through a list of potential concerns. Really sort of try to quantify it as best you can, because that can also guide the choice in tooling, the choice in approach, what to emphasize first. Because the answer to these questions may not be the obvious one, because it's sometimes a little bit orthogonal. Which things are people are most annoyed over, and which things are actually costing the most time. Because ultimately that's the goal, like make your developers ship faster, more productive. And then, I would really, whether it's talking to us or, whoever else, it just, if it's actually good to talk to people and, get them to describe their point of view, whether it's them trying to sell something themselves or going, sort of doing a bit of an assessment of where, like, okay, so this is what you're using today. What might be a good path forward? Getting advice on this is, this is something that we often give advice on. I often, I find myself not having a product to sell somebody because they don't actually have the problem that we solve, or at least, maybe later. But I think it's quite important for us, to be candid about those things. And I suppose lastly, unless I can think of something more, any transition, especially if you're changing the way you deploy or build your applications, or and even more so if you're looking to re-architect, like say you're breaking up a monolith or something, understand that it's more complicated than even your most seasoned engineers will suggest. It will take more time, because you are going to be fixing a car while driving it. Yeah, it's it isn't. If you could just like halt everything, stop the world, and fix it, it would probably not be that much. It might not be that difficult. But because you're interleaving it with so much other work, just accept that it can take time, and by extension, if you can work out a way to do it in tandem and solve small problems along the way, as opposed to making it this big boulder of a project that may or may not actually finish. I wrote a bit of an article about the specific topic of breaking up a monolith, but this also applies to like retooling or moving to a different platform. Frame it as an effort and not a project. It is a sort of something that you do gradually alongside your other product development, because your customer is not going to care why nothing has happened for the last 6 months on your product, even though you're improving your infrastructure, which hypothetically is going to make everything magical at some point. Yeah, it's just you're going to want to do things in such a way that they're not disruptive. And I think that's often easier said than done, but always worth it in my experience.
Yeah. That's how I've seen it work as well. This one big refactoring change never works. It's like never works.
Yeah, no, I've witnessed some pretty disastrous rewrite projects that either did complete in like 4 times the amount of time it was supposed to take, or never completed at all. And you can seriously damage a company's velocity that way. Yeah.
And then we can wrap up. Now, the flip side of this question is, if I'm the CEO or the business executive or the CRO of this high growth company, what are your recommendations in terms of like, what should they understand about infrastructure and technology that makes it easier for them to understand how fast the business can ship new product? And I'm asking that, because sales always comes in, I'm stereotyping, but it's like, oh, we need this and that feature, and it needs faster, right? And then maybe a more like hypothetical situation. I'm the founder. I constructed my product in a low code solution, and now all of a sudden I'm growing, and now I need an actual engineering team. But what level of knowledge do you suggest business executives need to have about infrastructure so they can actually get what's going on in the background and have a collaborative relationship with engineering?
That's a very good question. I think one thing that my observation that it hasn't been too combative, really. I think so it kind of goes both ways. I think it's also important from the other direction, from the sort of the sort of the CTO organization or the CIO. They should also be able to quantify the benefits of an infrastructure program. And an infrastructure program can be a lot of different things. It can be replatforming to Kubernetes. It can be breaking up a monolith. It can be whatever other technical depth you might think. It's investing in developer tooling experience. I think it's sometimes, if you don't back these things up with numbers, it becomes quite nebulous and it's sort of easily sidelined. But the thing is, what we help our customers do is really for their own, benefit and sanity, to understand what's the potential drag on productivity, and even just down to the hours an engineer has to spend on X, to some task every week, extrapolated to the year. It actually often ends up being a massive amount of money that is left on the table. And that's to say nothing of the opportunity cost. It's really, sometimes, and if you don't invest in this at all, you might as well ask your sales team to just go back to binders and faxes and not use Salesforce. Yeah. They understand for themselves how important it is to have a fluid, easily reportable, rapid interaction, answer customers really fast, understand where all of them are. So there's infrastructure involved on that front as well. Putting it in that context, you sort of maybe from somebody who's more tuned to the revenue side of things, they already have a sense of this. The tooling org, the developer experience org, the CTO, CIOs, et cetera, they just need to be able to articulate in these same terms, this is a potential drag on the business if we don't do this. And then articulate a good plan that doesn't, to the previous point, stop the world while some, nebulous refactoring happens, but rather put a timeline on, this is an effort that we would want to be complete within this amount of time. We dedicate this amount of resources in our engineering side, maybe hire that one person that can help with the project. And the net benefit is supposed to be this. It's a little bit of a sort of, sometimes sort of a hand-wavy exercise to try and estimate the money and time you save. Mm-hmm. But, you can start somewhere. It doesn't have to be so precise. You just at least get an order of magnitude. Yeah. Is this, slowing us down by 10%, 50%? What is it? Yeah. What can we save in hiring by doing this versus not? Or, put it in these relatively concrete terms. I think, and that's, we all need to speak to each other in terms that we understand. And I think that's sort of, I think that can be very helpful in terms of, your specific question on what, non-technical leadership should understand about infrastructure. It is infrastructure. It's what you can't build on sand. These are the pillars that your product actually works on. It is not ephemeral. It is very expensive to re-platform and do these big changes, and doing it in a shoddy way. It means, that you basically relegate yourself to maintaining your product as opposed to developing it if you don't do it right. And, the specifics of Kubernetes versus containers, understand where the market roughly is heading. So you don't, you can maybe map that to your sort of risk appetite.
Yeah.
Like if everybody's adopting Kubernetes and I'm not particularly risk tolerant, then just do that. That's totally fine. That's a safe choice. But yeah, you don't really have to. You should also just be able to trust your CTO, CIO, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why you hired them in the first place. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Jon, this was a super productive conversation. Thank you so much. Any closing thoughts? People can find you by going to garden.io, correct?
Yes, correct. While closing thoughts, I should remark that we just closed our Series A funding round. I'm very pleased to report that. I've alluded to this, that we're growing the team, and we really are. We're tripling the size of the team this year. So we are hiring really on all fronts. We have people in 6 different countries already. So I just wanted to kind of put that hiring message out there. I know like everybody's looking to hire people, and especially people who are some sort of specialization in our DevOps space, but we are hiring on all fronts. There's marketing, customer facing engineers, R&D engineers, there's customer success. There's a longer list. It's all on our website as well. Just looking for smart and fun people to work with. And that's kind of the energy that we're trying to build.
Well, congrats on the Series A. That's a big milestone. We're recording this during March, and we all know the equity markets have kind of cooled off from the heated days of 21, and so that's a big accomplishment. Congrats. And are you hiring remotely or in Berlin, or can I be anywhere in the world?
It's focused on North America and Europe, or those time zones basically. But we're remote first. We do have a bit of a base in Berlin. We have some people on the West Coast in the US, and then everything in between, but remote first for sure.
Fantastic. Jon, this was great. Thank you so much. Best of luck for Garden. Congrats again on your Series A. And we should do another check-in towards the end of the year and just hear how things have progressed and what has changed in the industry.
Oh, for sure. Thank you so much. This has been great.